Hey guys, it's that evil hag here with Loremaster of Sotek.
Hello.
And today we're Warhammer cryptozoologists. So we teamed up to bring you the 5 most terrifying creatures to roam the old world, and it's just the beginning. You will learn about those vile sons of bitches and find out where the inspiration for them came from. Here we go then. Number 5, Sorrow Swarm. It's all yours, Sotek.
All right. So, to start off our list, we have the sorrow swarms. These nasty little critters at a distance appeared like a cloud of beautiful multicolored butterflies. Created by the chaos god Zinch, they are actually quite terrifying when you get rather close to them. Each of them is roughly the size of an apple, and they look like normal butterflies, just of very vivid colors, as is to be expected with Zinch. However, when you look closely at them, you'll note that all of their legs end in very sharp spikes that can pierce the flesh of any human very easily. And on top of their slender bodies, where you would expect there to be a butterfly's head with antenna, is instead a small human head that has a long, dripping pink tongue that is about 6 inches long most of the time, but can go longer. These creatures, what they like to do is they will find a human and latch onto your face, cutting into your skin to make you start crying from pain. And then once you start crying, they use their tongues to eat up your tears. That's why they're called sorrow swarms. They usually travel in swarms of about 100 or more butterflies in order to basically pounce on the best targets. And once they start tasting your tears or you start crying around them, they often work themselves up into a frenzy and will quickly get to the point where they will use their tongues to simply rip out your tear ducts. That way they can get better access to it and can cause a horrific amount of damage because of that. Also, as tears are their primary source of food and their preferred delicacy, they tend to target children above all others because children are much easier to make cry.
Oh man, that's sweet. That's absolutely charming. So, I have news for you guys. Sorrow Swarm exists in real life. Well, sort of. There are species of moths, for example, Hemiceratoides hieroglyphica, which feed on tears of larger animals like deer or crocodiles, but also birds. And they have a very similar nasty proboscis, just like you described. And guys, I stumbled upon a scientific dissertation describing moths and butterflies drinking human tears too. And it explicitly stressed the pain of getting that goddamn harpoon like proboscis in your eye. So, real life horror much. And I think I'll just take a train to Nopesville. Screw that middle of nowhere. Thank you. And
Thank God. Thank
yeah,
God they don't travel in swarms.
yeah, exactly. But I knew that my fear of moths came from somewhere. Everybody just laughs at me, but I knew it. And when it comes to the folklore, Star of Swarm obviously reminds me of some depictions of the fairies, especially in British legends, where those critters were quite nasty and ravenous and totally not Tinkerbell. Okay, let's move to number 4. And first, listen to that. It is only by the grace of Sigmar that I live, but I am so very cold and so very hungry. After the attacks by the chaos filth in the pass above Skalvad, I became separated from the war party and have seen no living soul since. I can remember a little of the battle in truth, but a savage blur of flashing axe blades, steaming blood and snow as white as death. Day and night have become a grey twilight to me, and I could not say how long ago that was or how far I have staggered on, half blind and hungry. And I write these few lines in my journal in a desperate attempt to keep my sanity. I cannot account for my continued survival, but my wounds have at least stopped bleeding, and save for the cut in my stomach, which is every hour more worrisome, their pain has faded to a dim echo of what it was. If only I could be warm again. If only I could have something to eat. It is all I think of between dark waking dreams I do not dare to recall. Is strange, passing strange, for I cannot remember the enemy striking me there. The emptiness, imagining things so hungry, cannot think. A fire in the vase, so hungry. That's a parchment scrap found in the ruins of a destroyed encampment in the Vorgo cracks. No bodies were found. So tell us, Sotek, what the hell is that?
So that passage were the unfortunate last written words of a man who became what are known as Morngulls. Morngulls are these horrific creatures, probably one of the most nightmare-inducing things you can run into in the Warhammer world, that live very isolated up in the cold, dark places of the mountains. Morngulls, the way they form is essentially when a human goes out into the wilds of the mountains, the deep colds, and for whatever reason, they basically get stranded. You know, they're damned. There's no way they're going to survive. What will happen is some of the individuals grow very, very desperate in their attempt for survival, just like people in our world have. And they have fallen to the horrific act of cannibalism in order to survive, devouring their friends and family. Um, but in the Warhammer world, that comes with a pretty severe punishment just from the nature of the crime you're committing. For those who commit cannibalism and are stuck in the cold places of the north, they will usually wander and their minds will continue to degrade, and a gaping wound will begin to appear on their stomach. And it will grow and grow and grow and grow until at last they die and their body is literally severed in half with all of their entrails and their stomach just basically hanging out. However, they're not truly dead. What happens is once they go down, they have so much desperation to survive in their body, and they have basically built up such a horrible malice towards their situation and everything else in life that dark magic is basically drawn to them, because the winds of magic, much like demons, are drawn to really powerful, strong emotions. So dark magic begins to swirl around this corpse and the spirit, and it basically taints and saturates it with an insane amount of dar or dark magic. And the cadaver becomes warped and twisted in a very rapid succession. Their hands grow out to be these massive, horrific talons. Their body, the torso, upper body only, grows to be stretches out grotesquely, tearing the flesh and muscle and bone alike to make these horrifically sized creatures, and their mouths open to be feet wide, filled with needle sharp teeth. And these are the creatures we know as Morngulls. They're not ghosts, they're not revenants, they have an actual physical presence. They're not actually spirits, which makes them all the worst. And they are basically cold hunger that that only the truly unfortunate experience out in the wild made manifest. Morngulls are completely and utterly damned, even beyond that of other undead. They are condemned to an eternity of empty hunger and terrible isolation, doomed to wander the chill barrens alone, preying on anything they can find, whether it's man, orc, beastmen, or what have you. Thankfully, most of the time they're kept to the mountains, but when winter comes and snow falls on the lands below, the Morngulls can travel south freely. And that is when terrible accidents begin to happen around and villages mysteriously disappear with no corpses left to be found. These horrible creations are insanely powerful compared to what many would expect. For instance, one of their more notable features is, despite their immense size, because of the amount of dar that surrounds and lives within them, because they're basically a rebirth of shadow and icy fog, they can basically walk through broad daylight, and it's incredibly difficult to see them. If you were looking at them, it would look like you were looking at a mirage. It would be very wavy and indistinct, and you wouldn't be sure what it was, or even that you were in danger, until it was literally on top of you, reaching for you to shove into its maws. And because of this, it's also incredibly difficult to kill. because it's immune to most forms of damage as it sort of phases between reality and not. The other things that are worth noting about it is it has two pretty nasty distinct features. One is that being a creature born of cold, horrible death, which in Warhammer, the way you die, if you end up coming back, tends to relate how you're going to come back. Mournguls are like a living blizzard. Wherever they go, there's constantly swirling ice around them, and they bring everything to much, much worse temperatures. And it makes moving around them agony as the blood in your veins starts to freeze. So if you're going to try and fight one or even run from one, you need to be gone before it gets close. Because if it gets too close, you're not going anywhere quick. And lastly, of course, it has a pretty nasty habit which is referred to in Warhammer as carnophagy, which is that even if you do somehow miraculously manage to wound a Mourngul that's pursuing you, if it consumes flesh or a corpse, the meat and everything else it consumes will just fall through its stomach, and it won't sate its hunger, or angry hunger. So I guess anger does work. It will instead just keep coming at you, and anything it consumes won't satisfy its hunger, but it will heal any damage the creature takes and return it to maximum potential. Other than that, they're practically impossible to kill. The only way to deal with a Mourngul is to use fire to scare it away. But even though it's afraid of fire, and you can use fire to ward it from you, the fire won't actually kill it. They are incredibly difficult creatures to kill. And even when you do kill them, it's more like you're banishing them, and they're not necessarily dead forever.
Oh man. The night is truly dark and full of terrors up there north. So, probably a lot of you are already thinking what I'm thinking. The Mourngul is an interesting take on the concept of the Wendigo. And in case all you knew about those bastards is from Supernatural, let me get things straight for you. The tales of Wendigo originate from Native American tribes historically living along the Atlantic coast. And even though the Mourngul is bound to the cold as mountainy wastes, like you just heard, while Wendigos supposedly roam the forests of the Great Lakes region, the general principle is similar. They got a thing for the juicy human meat and a little bit of a warm embrace. And they're both something between a monster and a wight, even though Sotek just told you that they do have corporeal form, but regardless, they are still very hard to see because they are like a mirage. Still, both Wendigo and the Mourngul have some man-like features to their appearance, albeit horribly twisted. Some of the tribes believe the Wendigo to be of non-human origin, while others claim the person can turn into one if pushed to cannibalism by either greed or famine, just like the Mourngul. I feel though that there is a certain difference, because the Mournguls are born of sort of necessity, right? Our survival instincts, like Sotek said, might force us to unspeakable things to stay alive. But Wendigos symbolize more of broadly defined hunger, literal and figurative. You don't need to face starvation to think that eating your bros will get you superhero strength and thus power over your tribe, I guess. Okay, time for number 3, the eyeless ones. More of those chill vibes coming from you, Sotek.
So the eyeless ones are Kislevite special, I could say. They come from Warhammer's equivalent to the wonderful lands of Russia and Eastern Europe.
Oh yeah.
So the eyeless ones, essentially, when you die in Kislev, naturally, or however, your corpse is taken out into the snow, far out into the snow, and they leave you there. Because the ground is far too frozen to be broken by shovels for a grave, basically permafrost. And wood in Kislev is considered too precious to waste on pyres. You can't just burn every single corpse that shows up. It's much easier just to drag them out and leave them for the elements. However, according to the legends of Kislev, The dead sometimes wake and try to find their way back to the stanitsa. To prevent this, however, the Kislevites have adopted a policy of removing the eyes from anyone who dies so that the corpse cannot see which way it's going. However, there are some restless, hungry spirits who do not let this deter them, and they have returned to life in their old form, though their skin is bleached white and their eye sockets remain empty. These creatures are undead, and they're not actually the person who died. They don't have any of their old personality. Instead, all they have is a hunger for the warm touch of the living. That's all they care about. However, unlike many forms of undead, not only do they not require a necromancer to raise them, they're independent thinking enough to hide their features under cloaks and shawls. That way they can prey on travelers, which once they get close to you, by merely touching you with any part of their skin, they can begin sucking your soul out of your body to the point that you go unconscious. And once you do, and they've absorbed a satisfying amount of your warmth, they will proceed to force their fingers into your eye sockets and tear out your eyes for themselves. So the eyeless ones are particularly terrifying creatures. Thankfully, they only naturally, quote unquote, occur in Kislev. But this is why, should you ever go through the nasty lands of Kislev, never expect help from a stranger. And if you do see a stranger, never offer help, because you can never be 100% sure if it's really human.
Sounds about right. Sounds like home. Okay, so tracing a single origin of those neat crawlers is kind of impossible. But the general idea stems from so-called revenant burials, observed in many cultures around the world. And before you raise your eyebrows, let me tell you, you actually heard about it. Oh yeah, you did. Unless the idea of chopping a vampire's head off just to shove it up its ass before putting him back underground is foreign to you. So, revenant burials, that's a general term used for various funeral practices aimed to prevent your dead mom from rising from the grave to bite your head off, right? From our good old Polish beheading, hand wiring, and stake to the heart treatment, through Greeks blocking the crypts with heavy stones, to Roman British shoving the body face down, the ways of mutilation or mistreatment, well, to our standards, mistreatment, varied basing on how exactly the living were afraid of the given dead. The Kislev people apparently didn't like zombie stalkers. So there you have it, eyes out. Good luck finding your way back. And yeah, whenever you wander around Eastern Europe, don't expect help. Okay, number 2, the amalgamation beast. That's a quite peculiar one. So tell us about it.
Yeah, it's a pretty concerning name. Also known by titles such as its infamy as the Host of Souls or the Knot of the Damned. The amalgamation beast is technically a demon, though it's a little weird compared to others of its kind. For those who are unfamiliar with the Warhammer Fantasy universe, whenever a human feels an emotion, well, not necessarily human, a mortal feels an emotion, that emotion is carried by the winds of magic naturally into the realm of chaos. And when it reaches the realm of chaos, it takes a physical form. And these manifest as what we know as demons. Of course, the 4 chaos gods themselves are just incredibly potent bastions of similar-minded emotions that have collected into an entity that's capable of thought, planning, and other horrific things. But not all of emotions come out so clear-cut. When mortal emotions reach the realm of chaos, most of the time they'll form just a full-fledged regular demon. On occasion, however, they clump together to form unruly blobs of energy that function like cancers in the void of the realm of chaos. When they get too large, the realm of chaos will naturally reject them and just launch them out into the chaos waste, which is part of the physical plane, where they take actual shape, becoming something out of a madman's nightmare. The amalgamation beast is basically a giant, massive sack of undulating flesh. Its hide consists entirely of countless faces that are stitched together and animated by just natural chaos magic that flows through it. Each individual of the thousands of faces on its body is frozen in some expression of joy, hate, love, despair, or any other emotion you can think of, depending on that particular emotion that created that piece of the amalgamation beast. The way it moves, however, is that occasionally it's the mouths on these horrific faces have these giant tentacles that launch out and grab onto the earth and drag it like a giant rolling ball that's just a horrific writhing mass. And it basically just drags itself aimlessly until it sights prey, which its preferred prey is, of course, humans. When it does find a human, it will basically race towards you, and should it catch you, it will lash onto you with the tentacles and pull you close so that all of the mouths can start to tear at you with their teeth. And once you're dead, the tentacles will pull the corpse and press it against itself, where your body will be absorbed and your consciousness and your face will be added to that of the amalgamation beast. To make things worse, the amalgamation beast, although essentially mindless, it has a pretty horrific type of predator intelligence to it. It can see in the dark. It doesn't need light to see. It's incredibly powerful. Its strength and toughness is essentially on par with that of a dragon, except for it's a giant, colossal sack of meat. And many times it even has worse mutations than just faces. Oftentimes, in the seams between the faces where the stitches are, keeping them all together, the stitches will break open and thousands of arms or legs or other various appendages will come out, allowing it to crawl and propel itself forward at a faster rate. It's really, really a well-together put nightmare. And because it's sort of a demon, it can't be killed, unlike demons. But because it's sort of a demon, attacks don't always work that well against it. It has a natural aura of magic protecting it that makes many things like physical weapons, magic itself, or ranged attacks just sort of not have any effect. They almost phase through it. But it won't have any problems phasing when it catches up to you, to add you to its own horrific form.
So yeah, that's that cutie just sings H.P. Lovecraft to me, with its multiple faces, tentacles, and insanity. Although those faces, there's something incredibly theatrical, right, in the amount of well, again, faces twisted in various emotions. But anyway, Howard, I mean, Mr. Lovecraft, we are on the first name basis. He surely wasn't the first to imagine some cosmic / body horror like that. Actually, one of his buddies, Clark Ashton Smith, featured a similar monstrosity in the Colossus of Ljorgen, or damn, those guys and their impossible to pronounce names. Chronologically speaking, though, we have sort of an amalgamation of bodies on a cover of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. So there's a little bit of philosophy for you. They form a figure of a huge king, and basically it is a political metaphor, but still kinda you. We get shitload of examples in horror movies and books, just like, I don't know, just think of the original The Thing with handsome Kurt Russell. And there are, of course, similar monsters in tabletop and computer games, like the Corpse Gatherer in my good old Dungeons and Dragons. When you guys were growing up on Warhammer, I was just nerding with Dungeons and Dragons, so. And then we have the behemoths in Clive Barker's Jericho. But what makes the amalgamation be so unnerving is that, you know, you said that those body parts fall out of it, but still the fact that it consists mostly of faces, That's really disturbing because we all know that the face is what gives a person identity and, all that societal, psychological nonsense. But still, disturbing. So, yeah, here I think we reached this episode's number one, the sleeper. And the court is yours, Sotek, to tell us about this beastly abomination.
All right. So, I would like to ask everyone to take a brief mental trip with me. So, imagine you go to a dwarf hole and you go down and down and down and down and down. And the further down you get, you have this unnerving feeling in the back of your mind like there's something that's aware of you. And the further down you go, the worse it gets. You begin to feel anxiety, you begin to feel fear, and you don't understand why, you just do. And when you get in towards the lower deeps, you'll begin to have nightmares. You'll have dreams where, for reasons you can't explain, you will see yourself get up, take out your knife, and slit the throat of everyone that's hanging out with you. Your family, your friends. You just see yourself brutally murdering all of them. So you never get a good night's sleep because every time you close your eyes, there's horrific nightmares of violence and bloodshed waiting for you. And it just gets worse the deeper down you go. Then you find a tunnel. You follow that tunnel down and you come into a room, a large room, that 3/4 of it are full of a strange gelatinous mass that looks like rotting custard. And within that rotting custard, there's a weird flicker of green lightning that seems to pass beneath that layer every once in a while. And it kind of glows with a pale phosphorescent light as well. And it smells just terrible, just like rotting flesh. And every once in a while, as you're walking along past this mass, you see various cancerous growths, very strange, kind of weird looking mutations, quite a few tentacles dripping with some form of mucus just lying on the ground, and a bunch of thick white cilia stood out like hairs on the surface. Now, imagine you go to another room that's just as large, just as filled. And you go to another room, and another room, and another room, all the way around in a circle, a huge circle. And then you realize there's a ramp that leads down. You go down, and the entire roof has been caved in by this huge gelatinous mass. And at the very center of the room, hanging upside down from the mass, is essentially the form of a giant praying mantis. But instead of just having the two front arms of a mantis, it has those plus 8 additional spike-ended chitinous legs. And instead of 2 eyes, it instead has 10. But lucky for you, it's peacefully asleep. So you hope. This is the abomination known as the sleeper. And that entire gelatinous mass, which makes it one of the largest creatures to ever have existed in Warhammer Fantasy, rivaling that of dragon, ogre, shaggoths, and giants, was the only one left of its kind. And it was buried deep, deep, deep beneath the hold of Karakir, which many of you may know is an active and prosperous hold. Well, one day, King Alaric Ranulfson, who's the king of Karakir, went on an escapade, and he left a prince in charge who was dear friends with one Gotrek Gurnison, the greatest or worst, depending on how you view it, slayer to ever live. And while the Dwarf King was gone, the hold got taken over by Greenskins. But the Greenskins were acting strange. They talked with a weird, chirping, high-pitched language, and they were organized. Terrifyingly organized. They didn't fight among each other. They used complex weaponry. The goblins and orcs were using guns, and they were much stronger than the dwarves had ever remembered them being. And the hold was lost. Karakirn fell to the enemy. So
That
the
sounds like Skarsnik was behind it all.
Skarsnik wishes he could pull this off. So the dwarves leave Karakir and go get Gotrek and Felix, come back, force their way in and start encountering all kinds of horrors. They encounter these giant pale orcs with massive cancerous fungal-like growths sprouting out of their back that when they go up against Gotrek and multiple dwarves, including hammerers, despite hitting that orc with all of their might, and I'm talking about Gotrek Garnison, whose axe by this point had easily slain a giant, a two-headed giant. He had killed a bloodthirster of Khorne with it. He had slain dragons. He had slain all sorts of horrific nightmares. Didn't leave a scratch. Couldn't hurt this thing. It was completely and utterly invulnerable. And it was much smarter and much faster than any greenskin they'd ever encountered before. And the greenskins, the only way they could defeat it was it had a golden necklace hanging around its neck with a kind of a strange black stone in the center. And on accident, Felix removed this while trying to blind the orc, and suddenly he was vulnerable and went down quite quickly. And they managed to butcher all the orcs and goblins inside the hold, though they discovered some disturbing things, such as the orcs were mining and smithing and doing things that no greenskin or orc has ever done. Goblins were weaving, for God's sakes. So they cleared out the hold and killed all these things, and they found the only surviving dwarves in the hold, who thankfully had survived because they were hiding behind an impenetrable gate covered in runes that could only be opened from the inside. Well, they opened it, and the dwarves had been there for about 2 months without any food or water. But they're dwarves, they're hardy folk, they survived. They were very gaunt, very weak, and seemed kind of distracted, but they were all right. So the dwarves of Karakir start to celebrate. They held a grand feast in the hall that night, to which, of course, the other dwarves did not go because they were too weak to attend. They needed their rest. And they drink like insanity until they all pass out. But then, during the night, when all of them are drunkenly sleeping, they all start hearing screaming. Lots of screaming. And suddenly, dwarves who had prepared the meals and dwarves who had not drunk start trying to push their way through the doors, only to be hacked down by these horrible greenskins who were definitely dead, missing arms, missing bottom halves of their body, organs hanging out, bones broken, heads facing the wrong way. The greenskins, all of them, despite being dead, were still moving and were still fighting. And the dwarves, and being drunk as they were almost slaughtered. They barely managed to escape with what they could and made their way back to the other dwarves who were starving, and they sealed themselves in with those dwarves, only to realize that suddenly those dwarves had also taken up arms against them, as they began to mention something called the sleeper, and how they couldn't be allowed to live because they threatened the sleeper and its plans. Well, thankfully, the dwarves were fairly easy to deal with, though they realized one of the dwarves was also wearing a golden necklace hidden beneath his shirt. They pursued him, and it turns out this dwarf was an engineer. And this sleeper creature had not only taken over his mind, which he was able to express, because he had tried to leave the hold to get help, and he was captured by the orcs and taken down into the depths where he encountered this mysterious entity. And this necklace was placed upon him, and now he was completely and utterly enthralled by it. And in its sway, he built it, basically took his knowledge and used the orcs and him to build traps that murdered many dwarves. And he was even building a fully functioning and improved steam tank, which is insane because dwarves would never build such a thing. But his was amazingly powerful, and it was by the skin of their teeth that Gotrek and Felix managed to kill him, because he was also invulnerable so long as he wore the necklace. So they go down to the depths to deal with this foul creature once and for all, realizing how bad things are. But of course, the closer they get, the worse it gets. The anxiety builds up, the fear is petrifying, they can barely move at times. Gotrek, being the most stoic dwarf to ever live and being fairly immune to magic, being a dwarf and holding one of the axes of Grimnir, manages to push down until they encounter a group of the Pale Orcs. But through their tenacity and some unfortunate sacrifices, they manage to defeat them. And then Gotrek's best friend, who had mysteriously vanished and who they were looking for, appears. He had been gone for less than 24 hours, and he was wearing a necklace. Less than 24 hours, he was already completely brainwashed. And the necklace made him so powerful that he went from being a merchant who could barely hold his own in a fight to being so swift and strong that Gotrek Gurnison was struggling to even stand a chance against him. However, Gotrek had to do the hardest thing in his life. They got the necklace away from him, and Gotrek Gurnison killed his own friend, murdered him in cold blood because he had to. So they descend further into the depths and past all those scenes I described earlier, and they come upon the sleeper. And just by being in its physical presence, its psychic abilities, essentially, which psychic abilities are incredibly rare in Warhammer Fantasy, they're kind of underneath the doctrine of magic. But it was so potent that both Gotrek and Felix forgot it was there and started arguing with one another and started fighting one another. Fighting to the death, legitimately. Gotrek was trying to kill Felix. Felix was trying to kill Gotrek. And Felix managed to shake it off a little bit, but even then he couldn't stop himself from fighting. And it was finally resolved when Gotrek threw his axe at Felix, who happened to be standing in front of the sleeper, and Felix ducked, so one of the antennae of the sleeper was completely cut off, and it awoke. Now you might think at this point, oh, okay, so the fight would have been over, right? No. Because the instant the sleeper awakened, it was screaming in agony, which practically made the both of them go deaf and felt like black tears were being ripped through their minds. The sleeper started going into action. It had all these horrifically giant-sized eggs, kind of like what you would see in the Alien movies, covered in slime, and all of a sudden, all of them dropped to the floor very quickly. And they opened up, and from all of them came baby forms of the sleeper, which still had giant hooked claws, very nasty mandibles, and were no slouches in a fight, and they swarmed Gotrek and Felix, who were struggling with everything they had to fight. Then, the sleeper enacted part 2, which was that it opened up pores along all of its belly that was covering the ceiling, or that was the ceiling, and started oozing this liquid mucus that in a matter of minutes had filled up to Felix's thighs and Gotrek's waist, and it was intending to drown them in it. And to make things even worse, Gotrek's axe can shatter through pretty much any creature's bone, any weapon in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. It takes very, truly powerful artifacts to stand against it. And the sleeper just decided to go toe-to-toe with him. It started lashing out at him, and occasionally he could cut through one of its legs, but more often than not, it could just block it. And its chitinous hide, although chipped, would be able to sustain the damage. And to make things even worse, when the sleeper all the sleeper's children were wiped out, it initiated the final phase of desperation and started mutating horribly. And that entire ceiling of white undulating mass started producing tentacles at a horrific rate. And each of the tentacles had a unique mutation. Some of them ended in lamprey mouths full of needle-sharp teeth that lashed onto Felix and Gotrek's flesh, pulling away chunks of it. Some of it ended in these spiked barbs that would smash into them, impaling them, and then ripping on the way out. Some of them ended in bludgeons that were used to hit them hard and try and knock them onto their feet beneath the mucus tide. And some of them ended in even more horrific, pretty much countless mutations. This thing was actively able to mutate itself at a rate never before seen by anyone. And the fight continued until the point that Gotrek got close enough to try and kill the brute. But it was not going to go down without a fight. When he tried to swing at it, it grabbed him in its claw and tried to cut him in half just by snipping him with one of its colossal mantis-like pinchers. But using his strength alone, he was able to prevent it. But then when he tried to swing his axe because he was close to it, it simply caught his axe in the other hand and started pulling Gotrek towards its mandibles, which were large and spiky enough to easily pierce his flesh and cut him in half. And it was only because Felix took a stupidly risky dive of heroism, which cut one of the knuckles on its pinchers, that Gotrek was able to rip his axe free and bury his axe in its skull. And when he did that, the creature let out a horrific wail that basically split their minds and their ears. And in that moment, Felix was able to see what the creature really was. He saw psychic images of what it had been, how it had once ruled the mountains as its own domain. It had had an empire of larvae and insects and uh, pre pre-modern human slaves, cavemen essentially. But it had lost all of its power due to assassination attempts and infighting between the various queens of these insects. And then the dwarves had come, the earliest ancestors of the dwarves with their ancestor gods, the Helms, and it had been pushed back. It had been pushed deep into the earth below. But before it left, it made a pact with none other than the inscrutable and dangerous chaos gods. And they gave it immortality and limitless power simply in exchange for it waiting for the proper time to just cause mayhem. And it was a brilliant creature, between inventing its own form of the steam tank with the knowledge it gained from the engineer, developing traps that were so complex that no dwarf could get past them without dying, and it had even started having the orcs prepare massive carts filled with its eggs that were being encased in iron-laden mine carts, very well disguised, that were going to be pushed by the dwarves along rails that connect all of the holds, and basically unleash her young and her abilities in every single hold in the entire Karazankor. And we're talking about dwarves here. Dwarves that are so resistant to magic that they can mostly take a fireball and it will simply bounce off them. And this thing was getting into their brains with ease. Even after the creature died, though, it didn't end there. Gotrek and Felix went up, and Gotrek readily admitted to Felix when the two talked about the fact they nearly killed each other, that Gotrek, with all of his willpower, all of his strength, and his runic axe, did not have the physical ability to strike at the sleeper while the two of them were fighting. He knew the sleeper was tricking him. He had figured that out. He was willing his body to attack the sleeper, and he physically could not because it was that powerful. So he had to put Felix between it and him and throw his axe at Felix, hoping Felix would dodge in time, which thankfully he did. But finally, after the creature died, which when it did die, it basically caused a horrific cave-in due to the entirety of its bulk crashing down further into the deepness of the mountain, they went back up to those dwarves who had been mind-controlled. There were no more necklaces. There was no more sleeper. There were no more sleeper's babies. Gotrek very carefully made sure they were all torched properly. But when they got back to the dwarves, even though the sleeper was dead and its influence was gone, 100%, it was no longer a piece of this world, they were still held captive by what it had done. It had still taken their minds to the point that the moment they saw the normal dwarves, these fallen dwarves simply picked up their knives and their axes and their daggers and marched forward to kill their friends and family. And the dwarves of Karakirn, along with Gotrek and Felix, had to do the somber duty of massacring barely alive, skeletally thin, starved dwarves because their minds were gone. And there was no way they were ever going to get them back because the sleeper's effect was that devastating.
Wow, so I was just sipping my coffee here, listening to that, and I sort of gagged at that part of mucus. The sleeper trying to drown the boys in his goo, and then it was. I just stopped any kind of eating and drinking activities because all the eggs and all the larvae, yum yum yum. So I think you guys, having listened all about a horrible alien giant creature buried under the earth, spreading insanity with its psychic powers, I think it rings a bell, and let me quote this. In his house at Riley, that Cthulhu waits dreaming. So I think this entity kind of fits on the similar shelf, even though it's a huge goddamn bug. But then again, what else is Cthulhu? He's a giant humanoid with a squid face and dragon wings. So yeah, Lovecraft and whoever made Sleeper up could shake hands if it was ever possible. So arthropods have always induced fear in people, And don't tell me, guys, that you don't flinch at spiders and roaches and centipedes or whatnot. And if you still claim that you don't, enlarge those creepy crawlies a billion times, and then we'll talk. So, yeah, like I said, the Great Cthulhu has a solid competition regarding the, spreading manic dreams and rendering the victims of his influence absolutely insane and murderous. And also being planted underground by external sort of creatures, even older and even more terrifying. And then obviously those four chaos gods, just the art of trolling is real within those four.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So there is actually more regarding Lovecraft and his potential influence on the sleeper, because aside of Cthulhu, he actually referred to some intelligent insects occasionally in his stories, and so did his contemporary admirer Ramsey Campbell. And in the end, to add some real life spice, a psychiatry professor from Zurich wrote a whole book on how there is evidence that ants and other hive-based insects possess psychic powers. And let me repeat that. He's a psychiatry professor. So this isn't a joke, and the way it's unfolding, I would say we should find ourselves a real-life Gotrek too. So, all right. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Sotek and I would be delighted to continue this old world terrifying bestiary as a series, if you enjoyed that.
We have so many more.
Oh yeah, we have so many more. We are just spending our evenings discussing more and more disturbing and disgusting beasts. All right, guys. So thank you ever so much for watching.
Let us know your favorite and or the one you would want the least to run into.
Absolutely. Let us know which monster we presented today is going to be your nightmare fuel for tonight. All right then. I guess I'll see you around, guys.
Oh, bye.